Alright, let's talk about one of the brightest yet briefest flames in English poetry, John Keats. Born in 1795 in London, Keats wasn't from an aristocratic or scholarly background. His father was a livery stable keeper, and his early life was modest. He went to a private school in Enfield and was later apprenticed to a surgeon. For a while, it looked like he'd become a doctor, not a poet. But fate had other plans. In London, around 1814, his interest in medicine began to fade as poetry took over. He discovered Edmund Spenser, and that changed everything. His Imitation of Spenser, written in 1813, was his first attempt at poetry. That early influence from Spenser, the lush imagery and musical rhythm, stayed with him throughout his career. This has been asked in exam. In the first one pate, by 1815, Keats met Leigh Hunt, the radical journalist, who became a huge influence. Through Hunt, he met Percy Bysshe Shelley and other romantic poets, a connection you should definitely remember for exam. His first book, simply titled Poems in 1817, didn't make much noise. The critics ignored it, but Keats wasn't discouraged. He poured his energy into a long, ambitious poem called Endymion in 1818, 4,000 lines long, full of youthful passion and promise. Critics tore it apart. Tory journals, especially the Quarterly Review, mocked him brutally for his Cockney background and political leanings. Yes, this attack has been asked in exam. Sadly, Keats was already in fragile health. Tuberculosis ran in his family, and these harsh reviews only worsened his spirits. Still, his creativity soared. In 1818, he wrote Isabella, or The Pot of Basil, and The Eve of St. Agnes, both filled with imagination, sensual detail, and deep emotion. The Eve of St. Agnes, in particular, is often considered his masterpiece for its romantic richness and painterly beauty. Around the same time, Keats started Hyperion, a grand, unfinished epic about the fall of the Titans, an idea influenced by Milton's Paradise Lost. It's powerful but also heavy, and his health made it hard to finish. The Eve of St. Mark, another unfinished work from 1819, showed how much he had grown in descriptive skill. In 1819, Keats wrote his most famous odes, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, To Autumn, and Ode on Melancholy. These poems mark his absolute poetic peak. Each explores beauty, transience, and mortality, recurring themes in his short, intense life. And of course, don't forget La Belle Dame sans Merci, that haunting lyrical ballad, short, musical, and utterly unforgettable. Keats also ventured into drama with Otho the Great and began another, King Stephen, which he never completed. The Cap and Bells, a lighter, fairy tale-like poem, also remained unfinished. Critics usually consider it below his usual standard, something examiners like to know. And then there's Fanny Brawne. She was the love of his life. They got engaged but never married. His illness made it impossible. The letters he wrote to her, published in 1879, reveal both his tenderness and his despair. This publication detail has been asked in exam. By 1820, his health collapsed completely. Doctors advised him to travel to Italy for warmer weather. He went to Rome hoping for recovery, but it was too late. He died there in 1821 at just 25 years old. On his tombstone are the words he chose himself. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. It's heartbreaking, but Keats' reputation only grew after his death. His shorter poems and great odes are now considered the pinnacle of English lyric poetry. His imagination, his love of beauty, and his deep emotional honesty secured his place among the immortals. Even modern writers were inspired by him. Anthony Burgess's novel Abba Abba, published in the 20th century, reimagines Keats's final days in Rome, another fact that's been asked in exam. So in just a few short years, Keats went from a medical student to one of the finest poets in English literature, proof that brilliance sometimes burns brightest when it burns brief. His first major poem, Endymion, came out in 1817, and that date has been asked in exam. Keats dedicated the poem to another young poet who died tragically, Thomas Chatterton, often called the Marvelous Boy. Now, you'll definitely recognize the opening line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." It's one of the most quoted lines in English poetry and a common exam favorite. The poem is written in rhyming iambic pentameter couplets, what we call heroic couplets. Structurally, it's divided into 4 long books, each around 1,000 lines. The story itself comes from Greek mythology. Endymion is a shepherd loved by the moon goddess Selene, though Keats renames her Cynthia, another name for Artemis. That name swap, by the way, has been directly asked in exam. The poem begins with a pastoral scene full of shepherds, trees, rivers, and music. They pray to Pan, the god of shepherds, while young people dance and the elders speak of Elysium. Endymion, described as a brain-sick shepherd prince, suddenly falls into a trance and his sister Peona takes him to rest. When he wakes, he tells Peona about his dream of Cynthia, the moon goddess, and his deep, mystical love for her. So the whole poem becomes a quest for divine beauty, the first real glimpse of Keats's central idea that beauty is truth. Then comes Isabella, or The Pot of Basil, written in 1818 and published 2 years later. This one's a dark, romantic tragedy adapted from Boccaccio's Decameron that's been asked in exam too. Isabella loves Lorenzo, a man beneath her in rank, but her 2 cruel brothers murder him to protect the family's honor. In a dream, Lorenzo's ghost appears and tells her where he's buried, another detail examiners like to ask about. Heartbroken, Isabella exhumes the body, cuts off Lorenzo's head, and hides it in a pot of basil, which she tends obsessively until she dies of grief. It's a haunting story, mixing passion and horror, a kind of Gothic romance. Isabella came just before the eve of St. Agnes, and both share that medieval, tragic tone. The poem later inspired the pre-Raphaelite painters, especially William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais, a cultural link that's come up in exam questions. Now, Hyperion, the unfinished epic. Keats began it in late 1818, while he was nursing his brother Tom, who died of tuberculosis that December. The poem was left incomplete, published in 1820 in the collection Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and other poems, and yes, that publication detail has been asked in exam. Hyperion retells the story of the Titans' downfall, their defeat by the Olympian gods. It opens with Saturn and Thea mourning their lost power, and it builds toward the younger gods' triumph. The theme is the passing of old beauty into new, a metaphor for artistic renewal, but Keats abandoned the work, saying it had too many Miltonic inversions, meaning it felt too much like Paradise Lost. He later reworked its ideas into The Fall of Hyperion, which was published posthumously. So, to sum it up, Endymion is the dream of beauty, Isabella is love turned tragic, and Hyperion is the epic of loss and transformation. All 3 poems show Keats's growth from a romantic dreamer to a poet searching for the meaning of art and suffering, and all 3 are staples in exam papers. John Keats in his creative peak year 1819. This is when he wrote The Eve of Street, Agnes, Lamia, The Fall of Hyperion, and even The Cap and Bells, though that one was left unfinished. Let's start with The Eve of St. Agnes. Written in 1819 and published a year later in 1820. And yes, that publication date has been asked in exam. It's one of Keats's most romantic and visually lush poems. It's made up of 42 Spenserian stanzas, each with that smooth, rolling rhythm inspired by Edmund Spenser. The poem takes place on a cold January night, the eve of Saint Agnes, who is the patron saint of virgins. Her feast day is January 21st, and her eve, January 20th, was believed to have mystical powers. According to legend, and this part comes from John Aubrey's Miscellanies of 1696, young maidens could dream of their future husbands if they followed certain rituals before sleeping. This connection to Aubrey's folklore has also been asked in exam. In the poem, we meet an old beadsman praying in the cold chapel, while inside the castle, preparations for a wild feast are underway. Meanwhile, Madeline, the young heroine, dreams of her lover Porphyro, a man her family despises. Her longing and innocence tie directly to the legend of Saint Agnes's Eve, and that detail has also come up in exam questions. Porphyro sneaks into the castle with the reluctant help of Angela, an old servant. She helps him hide in Madeline's bedroom, where he watches her fall asleep. In a dreamlike moment, he sets up a quiet feast beside her bed while she is still dreaming of him. This moment, the dream scene, has been directly noted in exam. When she wakes and sees him there, she is startled at first, but she quickly forgives him, saying she cannot hate his deception. In the end, they escape together into the stormy night. While Angela and the beadsmen both die, a haunting double ending that shows Keats's fascination with death and beauty intertwined. Now, moving to The Fall of Hyperion, a Dream. This is another 1819 poem, left unfinished before Keats's death. It's actually a reworking of his earlier Hyperion, an epic about the fall of the Titans and the rise of the Olympian gods. But here, Keats turns the story inward. The poem becomes a reflection on art, suffering, and the making of a true poet. The title, publication date, and its incomplete nature have all been asked in exam. It begins with a dream-like vision. The narrator finds himself at a strange post-Edenic feast, echoing that same sense of sensory delight we see in poems like Sleep and Poetry and Ode on a Grecian Urn, another detail that's come up in exam. He drinks a transparent juice and falls into a deep, visionary sleep. When he wakes, he is standing before a great temple with gates facing east, a symbol of spiritual awakening. There he meets Moneta, a mysterious priestess who challenges him to climb a staircase. But this climb is agonizing, a kind of symbolic death. The pain mirrors Apollo's transformation in the earlier Hyperion. Only by enduring this suffering, Moneta says, can the poet reach true vision. False poets, she warns, write without pain, but real creation demands sacrifice. That theme, the poet's test of suffering, has been tested repeatedly in exam. When the narrator finally ascends, Moneta grants him a vision of the Titans and of Hyperion's fall. The poem ends where Hyperion begins with Hyperion rising, and Keats leaves it unfinished, merging dream, myth, and self-reflection into one of his most profound works. So, to sum it up, The Eve of St. Agnes gives us passion, medieval romance, and visual richness. The Fall of Hyperion gives us vision, suffering, and the philosophy of art. Both show Keats at his most mature, torn between the sensual and the spiritual, and both are absolute exam favorites. Alright, let's talk about one of the greatest odes ever written in English, John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. Keats composed it in May of 1819, that miracle year when he wrote almost all his great odes. This one first appeared anonymously in Annals of the Fine Arts, and yes, that publication detail has been asked in exam. The inspiration came partly from Benjamin Haydon's articles on Greek art, but more importantly from Keats's own fascination with Greek ideals, balance, beauty, permanence. His urn isn't a specific artifact. It's like a perfect symbol, an imaginary Greek vase that holds time still. The poem is written in 5 10-line stanzas, a fact worth remembering for exam. Now, picture how Keats starts. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. That's one of the most famous openings in all poetry, and it's a favorite exam question. He's talking to the urn as if it's alive, calling it both a bride and a child. Why? Because it's silent, yet full of stories. A Sylvan historian, as he calls it, a storyteller made of marble, forever preserving scenes of ancient life. Then come the questions. What stories are on this urn? Lovers chasing maidens, gods mingling with mortals, music, dancing, the wild ecstasy of life, frozen in time. And Keats asks that timeless question, Who are these people? What struggle to escape? What mad pursuit? The energy is there, but motion has stopped. In the second stanza, we get that unforgettable contrast. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. This line has been directly asked in exam, and it captures the poem's heart, that imagined beauty, the art we can't hear or touch, is somehow more perfect than the real thing. The lover can never quite reach his beloved, never, never canst thou kiss, but she'll never fade either. They are forever on the edge of fulfillment. The third stanza bursts with joy. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. Keats piles on the word happy almost breathlessly. But behind that joy, there's a quiet ache. Because while the figures on the urn never age, they also never change. Their perfection is beautiful, but it's lifeless. In the fourth stanza, the tone shifts again. Keats notices a new scene, people going to a sacrifice, a priest leading a decorated heifer to an altar, and an empty town that will never be filled again. Time has stopped there too. It's haunting a moment of eternal stillness. Then we reach that final stanza, the one critics still debate. Keats addresses the urn directly. O Attic shape, fair attitude. He calls it a cold pastoral, meaning beautiful but distant. The urn will outlive us all, he says. Generations will fade, but it will remain, whispering its message. Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. This closing line, of course, has been asked again and again in exam. Now, that final statement, what does it mean? Critics have argued for 2 centuries. Is Keats saying beauty and truth are the same? Or is he letting the urn speak, showing that art gives only partial answers? Even modern readers are divided. But what everyone agrees on is the sheer beauty of the language, the calm music, the marble clarity, the quiet ache beneath the surface. When Keats wrote this, critics didn't love it. The real praise came later, from the mid-19th century onward. Today, it stands as one of the most perfect odes in English, a poem about art, love, time, and the eternal human wish to make beauty last forever. His famous odes, written mostly in 1819, capture everything that made him special: beauty, imagination, and the awareness that all lovely things must fade. And yes, these poems show up often in exam, so let's make sure you know them well. Let's start with Ode on Indolence. Indolence simply means laziness, that delicious, dreamy feeling of not wanting to do anything. Keats wrote this poem when he was struggling with practical worries like money and career. Still, he said the act of writing it gave him great pleasure. It wasn't published until 1848, long after his death. The poem has 10-line stanzas with a really interesting rhyme scheme. It starts with a Shakespearean quatrain, A, B, and ends with a Miltonic sestet, C, D, E, C, D, E. That structural mix has been asked in exam before. Next, we have Ode on Melancholy. This one is all about how to face sadness, and it has been directly asked in exam many times. The poem has 3 stanzas, each 10 lines long. Keats says we shouldn't try to forget sorrow by escaping into oblivion. In other words, don't drink from Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and don't be tempted by symbols of death. Instead, he urges us to embrace sadness because beauty and pain are intertwined. The key image comes when he says melancholy dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. Pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, they always coexist. In one of his most quoted lines, Keats writes that melancholy is found when we burst joy's grape, discovering sadness hidden within delight. Now comes Ode to a Nightingale, written in 1819 and published in 1820 in Lamia, Isabella, and other poems. This is one of his greatest works, a meditation on life, death, and art. The Nightingale's song fills the poet with joy, yet also reminds him of human suffering. While the bird's song seems eternal, human life is fragile, full of grief, sickness, and decay. The contrast between mortal pain and immortal art has been asked in exam, so underline that in your notes. The nightingale becomes a symbol of the poet's dream of immortality through art, something that outlives the body. Now let's look at Ode to Psyche. This poem marks a shift in Keats's style. Psyche, the goddess of the soul, had been neglected in myth, and Keats decides to worship her through imagination. He becomes both poet and priest, building her temple not in stone but in his own mind, an untrodden region of my own. That phrase has been raised in exam, so remember it. The poem celebrates the imagination's power to create beauty and meaning even in a world that forgets its gods. Finally, to Autumn, the jewel of them all. Written in 1819 after a walk near Winchester and published in 1820. This is often called Keats's farewell to poetry. It's calm, balanced, and deeply peaceful. Autumn is personified as a goddess sitting on the granary floor or watching the cider press. The poem moves through the day like a life cycle: morning abundance, afternoon fulfillment, and evening quiet. Keats tells Autumn to enjoy her own music, the hum of gnats, the bleat of lambs, the chirp of crickets, and the call of swallows gathering for migration. What makes to Autumn so powerful is its acceptance. It's not about longing or escape anymore, it's about completeness, about finding beauty even as things fade. Keats died just a year later, in 1821, in Rome, and somehow this poem feels like his peaceful goodbye. So, in short, indolence is about lazy escape, melancholy about joy and sorrow intertwined, nightingale about mortality and immortal art, Psyche about imagination as worship, and To Autumn about serenity and acceptance. These 5 odes together show Keats's entire journey from restless longing to tranquil peace. And yes, every one of them has appeared in exam questions, so keep them close. Keats wrote not just odes, but some incredible sonnets and songs that really show how his style evolved. Let's start with his sonnets. One of his earliest, to Byron 1814 and to Chatterton 1815, are tributes to poets he admired. But the most famous of all is On First, Looking into Chapman's Homer, written in 1815. This one always pops up in exams, so pay attention. It's a sonnet about the pure wonder Keats felt when he first read Homer's Iliad, not in Greek, but in George Chapman's English translation. He compares the feeling to discovering a new planet or standing speechless before a new world. It's the perfect poem about the joy of discovery through art. Then there's On Sitting Down to Read King Lear once again from 1818, where Keats reflects on maturity and creative renewal. Another from the same year, When I Have Fears, is haunting. It shows his fear that he might die young before fully expressing his imagination. Given how short his life was, this poem feels almost prophetic. Now, his songs are equally interesting. In Hymn to Apollo 1816, you see his early fascination with Greek mythology. You Say You Love 1817 is playful and romantic. But the standout is La Belle Dame sans Merci, written in 1819, and yes, that date has been asked in exam. It's a ballad, not a sonnet, and the title means The Beautiful Lady Without Mercy. Keats borrowed it from a 15th century French poem by Alain Chartier. The story is eerie. A knight meets a mysterious fairy woman who seduces him and leaves him alone and haunted. It's a classic example of the romantic blend of love and death, and it gave rise to the whole femme fatale idea in later art. Another lesser-known poem from this period is The Eve of St. Mark, written around the same time as his great odes, quiet, atmospheric, and left unfinished. Now, what really makes Keats fascinating are his letters. He wrote about 252 of them to his friends like Bailey, Reynolds, Woodhouse, and to his brothers George and Tom. These letters are almost as famous as his poetry because they reveal how he thought about art and imagination. In one letter to Woodhouse in 1818, he used the phrase egotistical sublime to describe Wordsworth's poetry. He meant that Wordsworth's voice was often centered on the self, his own experiences and emotions. Keats admired Wordsworth but preferred a different kind of art, one that was less self-centered and more open to the world. That's where his idea of negative capability comes in. Now, this term negative capability has been asked in exam almost every year. Keats coined it in a letter to his brothers on 22nd December 1817. He said, "Great writers like Shakespeare possess this ability, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. It's one of the most important ideas in romantic aesthetics." The negative part isn't negative in the bad sense. It means emptying yourself, staying open, not forcing meaning. For Keats, the best artists accept mystery rather than try to explain it. They prefer beauty over logic, imagination over certainty. That's why he admired Shakespeare so much. Shakespeare could become his characters without judging them. So, in short, Keats's sonnets and songs reveal his sensitivity to beauty and mortality. His letters show his deep reflections on art, and negative capability ties it all together. The idea that true creativity means embracing uncertainty. And yes, nearly every one of these points, the sonnet. On Chapman's Homer, La Belle Dame sans Mercy, his letters, and the idea of negative capability have been asked in exam. Alright. Let's talk about John Clare, often called the greatest laboring class poet, a phrase used by Jonathan Bate, and yes, that's been asked in exam. John Clare was born in 1793, the son of a poor farm laborer. He grew up in the English countryside, surrounded by the fields and animals that would later fill his poetry. His early works celebrate rural life, but they also mourn how it was changing. The enclosure movement was breaking up the open fields, and Clare felt that loss deeply. His first collection, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery, came out in 1820 and instantly made him famous. Then came The Village Minstrel in 1821. Remember that title? It's been asked in exam, followed by The Shepherd's Calendar in 1827 and The Rural Muse in 1835. Clare's poetry is remarkable for its honesty and its eye for detail. He wasn't writing about fancy estates or city life. He was describing the real countryside he knew, the wildlife, the changing seasons, the lives of ordinary people. Some of his best-known poems include First Love, Badger, The Skylark, and The Gypsy Camp, all exam favorites. His style is simple but heartfelt, and his love for nature shines through every line. Later in life, Clare struggled with mental illness and spent years in asylums. Even there, he kept writing. During that period, he produced pieces like Don Juan and Childe Harold, showing flashes of humor and sadness all at once. He died in 1864, largely forgotten at the time, but in the late 20th century, critics rediscovered him. Today, he is recognized as one of the most authentic voices of 19th century English poetry, the poet who spoke for the land and the people who worked it. So if you ever come across First Love or The Badger in exam, remember it's Clare's voice you're hearing, a poet of fields, seasons, and deep human feeling.